A Song of Ice and Fire, are commonly known as Game of Thrones because of its live-action television counterpart, is one of the greatest pieces of fantasy literature. Rivaled, of course, only by Lord of the Rings. Readers have debated for ages about which one is superior. One has pioneered the genre and the other has revolutionized it. While dark fantasy is certainly not a new concept and various stories such as The Witcher and Berserk have tried that before, Martin's stories have arguably had the greatest impact, from best-selling novels to the biggest and one of the greatest TV series ever made. Other than a few issues of pacing and uneventful chapters, Lord of the Rings doesn't have very many flaws. The Song of Ice and Fire series stands out for its intense political drama, but like the birth of a Targaryen, it's often a flip of a coin. It can be really wonderful to read Martin weaving a 4D chess game, however it can be incredibly cheap when the events are a one-to-one parallels of real events. A book is always at its strongest when it reflects original ideas. The political plot isn't the only thing that makes A Song of Ice and Fire great. It's the world building that's rather cosmic in nature and makes the world feel darker. Martin shines when the political events have a backdrop of fantasy, like an ornament over a well-woven dress. But why is that? Isn't Game of Thrones' biggest feature its political plot and grounded realism? Perhaps not. A Song of Ice and Fire is a fantasy, and what separates fantasy from a period piece epic is the creation of a secondary world that's completely separates from our own. The showrunners of Game of Thrones heavily downplayed the elements of fantasy from the books. For example, in the books, every one of the Stark children is a warg. Arya has warg visions, and she's definitely the second strongest warg other than Bran himself. Beyond Westeros, there are mysterious lands where dinosaurs and ancient and abandoned cities made of oily black stones lay dormant. The political events of Game of Thrones are heavily inspired by the events of medieval England and ancient Rome. The Valyrian freehold and its doom is inspired from ancient Rome, and the fall of Pompeii and the Battle of Five Kings is inspired from the War of Roses. Richard II and Joffrey Baratheon are also boy kings, drunken with power and their own majesty. Stark vs Lannister is York vs Lancaster. The Red Wedding was a real event as well and is known as the Black Dinner, and these are the events that are heavily covered in the first, second and third books. Robert Baratheon takes the crown from a Mad King, Aerys the second of his name, just as Edward IV does from Henry VI, also a Mad King. Like Robert, Edward II was a capable warrior, but once he held the position of the king, he didn't understand what to do. He spent his day whoring and drinking. After Richard of York is killed, his son Edward, the new Duke of York, leads a battle against Lancaster, just as Robb Stark does after the death of Ned against the Lannisters. Without the element of fantasy, Game of Thrones is just a telltale political thriller set in a fictional land that's just ripped off of real-world events. The elements of fantasy are Martin's originality and creativity, and that's what shines brightest. The one-to-one parallel to real-world political events sometimes cheapen the story because once you get the reference and unravel the plot, there's nothing else to dig for. Martin often has heavy criticism for the staple fantasy stories where a hero beats the Dark Lord and saves the world and thinks the heroic journey is cliched. But his own story has characters that undergo the pathway of the heroic journey. Let's look at a character that's defined by the heroic journey and compare that with some of the characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. Monkey D. Luffy has some naive and idealistic beliefs about the world. He wants to be a pirate because he thinks it's cool to go on a grand adventure with his friends and have fun. He's essentially a frog in a well. He easily defeats the pirates in the East Blue, and even though he takes some hit in the Paradise against the likes of Crocodile and Lucci, he still manages to beat them with sheer grit. However, we are shown the cracks in Luffy's ideology. He's poor at commanding a crew and isn't able to solve a problem that doesn't require punch fighting, such as the feud between him and Usopp, and often takes reckless decisions. When they are finally at the gates of the new world at Sabaody, Luffy loses his crew, and then in the Marineford saga, he is pitched between forces beyond his ability, such as Whitebeard and the Admirals. Luffy takes the biggest loss of his life and loses his brother Ace and decides to get stronger. In the new world after the time skip, Luffy is more pragmatic and grown as a leader. He's still idealistic, but he isn't naive anymore. A contrast drawn between him and Momonosuke to emphasize how much he has grown as a character. Jon Snow, Sansa Stark and Arya Stark all hold some naive views about the world. Jon believes in honor as living his life as a member of the fabled and mythic Night Watch. Sansa believes she will marry a prince like the songs and they will live happily ever after. And Arya believes she will be a knight in the misogynistic medieval world or be able to take revenge on her enemies. Soon these characters get a wider perspective of the world. Jon learns that the Night's Watch is corrupt and is falling apart. Sansa learns of princes like Joffrey, and Arya in Clash of Kings and Storm of Swords almost completely loses her will and identity when she is taken in by the Lannisters and the Boltons. Ned Stark and Robb Stark's death drives home the idea of naive idealism. Arya loses many of her friends to indiscriminate cruelty of soldiers who have been twisted over the years fighting a war. Jon loses Ygritte and Sansa is shown around like a pawn by other players to reclaim the North. Slowly the characters learn from their mistakes and their naive perceptions. Jon takes a more practical approach and eventually becomes the commander of the Night's Watch. Sansa grows stronger politically and learns to play the Game of Thrones, and Arya trains to become one of the Faceless Men. And although other than Jon, none of these characters are of heroic intent, it's likely they had been fighting a heroic battle against the White Walkers. And while what is excellent writing and character drama on Martin's part, it does fall under the set of heroic journey. In fact, arguably the characters in Lord of the Rings that take center stage, even though they are heroic, aren't under the path of heroic journey. Gandalf doesn't need a heroic journey. He's well aware of the events of the world and how to live in it.
You shall not pass!
And neither does Aragorn.
Put aside the ranger.
And while Frodo and Sam are naive because of how peaceful the Shire is, they don't get hardened and become more cunning to survive. In fact, one might argue that Gandalf had foreseen this ability of theirs to not be twisted in the slightest and thus entrusted them with the ring.
Why the halfling?
Perhaps it is because I'm afraid. It gives me courage.
Frodo didn't make the same mistakes as Bilbo and Gollum. He wasn't delusional about the true nature of the ring and knew it was the tool of the enemy, and he didn't take the ring by committing an act of cruelty and wasn't corrupted as severely on the hard road ahead. The only character in the Lord of the Rings that goes through heroic journey is Eowyn, but there's a twist there. Eowyn has a false set of beliefs that if she were a true knight or a true warrior, she'd be free from this cage that she feels she is in. It's a similar idealistic notion to the characters mentioned before. So when she meets Aragorn, a great Númenórean king, she projects on him the ideas she holds and mistakes that for love. Aragorn understands that but is gentle with her. Eowyn eventually defeats the Witch King with the help of Merry and almost dies because of it. So who was the biggest antagonist in Eowyn's story? Was it the society she lived in? Probably not, because before her, Galadriel was celebrated as a warrior.
Even the smallest person can change the course of the future.
And Theoden wanted her to not participate in battle because he didn't expect himself and Éomer to survive. He needed Eowyn to be the next ruler of the Mark. So was the great antagonist the Witch King? Well, no. Eowyn's antagonist is a cage and the notions she has built for herself.
I can fight!
No!
She is her own antagonist. Eowyn, who so wanted a life of a warrior, realizes that being a great person isn't in fighting mighty battles, but in healing. Even though she kills the Witch King, she couldn't save Theoden, and she was saved by Aragorn, who is great at healing and doesn't want to fight. That's what Eowyn never understands about Aragorn. He wants to be a king and he wants to fight, but only to protect what he loves. Aragorn's gallantry isn't a show of vanity, and Eowyn's love for him is just the love of an idea as she sees what she wants to. Eowyn wants to be free and wants to be a warrior, and she sees Aragorn and thinks he's free and is a great warrior. But once she sees Theoden die, she realizes how terrible warfare is and how misguided her ideas about the world and Aragorn were. Eowyn represents the idealistic fantasizing and the hero worshipping. Finally, Eowyn settles as a healer with Faramir, who represents the truth of Aragorn's belief. I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, not the arrow for its swiftness, not the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. Tolkien understood that true tragedy is in sinking of the heart. Every character in Lord of the Rings gives up their idealistic beliefs for a more realistic and grounded one, but they can't live with their sacrifice. Eowyn's dreams are crushed. Frodo has PTSD. Gimli and Legolas leave the lands and become sailors. And this loss of an idealistic belief is further symbolized in the story itself with magic leaving Middle-earth. One can take a step further and say that it symbolizes Tolkien's change of perspective before and after the First World War. It's clear that although Tolkien knows that a more objective and pragmatic view of the world is more necessary, but he wishes and likes the more easygoing and innocent way of living. He prefers the parties and the gossip of the Shire over the political squabbles of men and elves. He understands that the way of men and the way of elves is probably a more practical way of living, but he also shows us that it's the simple and good-natured hobbits that defeat the Dark Lord and not the men, elves or wizards. Gandalf and Aragorn's trust in the simple good of Frodo and Sam is what saves Middle-earth.
If more people valued home above gold, this world would be a merry place.
At first, this seems like a very cliched and naive view of the world. But after reading and understanding what Tolkien has written and what he's been through, it's impossible to disagree with him. And hoarded gold can be anything. Anything that defies an open and kind heart and supports the scheme of greed. Martin once said, criticizing Tolkien,
You look at Tolkien and at the end of the books, Sauron has been defeated, Aragorn is king. And Tolkien just says that he ruled wisely and well for 500 years or whatever. What was his tax policy? How did the economy function, under him? Did he encourage trade? Did he discourage it? What about the class system? The rising peasantry and the burgeoning middle class. Was those encouraged or put down? Did he give power to the aristocracy? The orcs, there are still tens, thousands of orcs left over at the end of Lord of the Rings. Did he pursue a policy of genocide toward them? Or did he reach out to try to educate the orcs and bring them into the mainstream and civilize them? We never get answers to any of these questions. We just get he rules wisely.
well, A Song of Ice and Fire doesn't have realistic evolution of language. Martin never described High Valyrian, that was for the show. Lord of the Rings isn't about the material world. Tolkien doesn't care about the material world. It's much more important for him that the characters, the good ones, at least stay true to their beliefs. Things such as taxes or policies are secondary and material concerns. And if that sounds very abstract and unrealistic, then it's because Lord of the Rings is a story just about that. Tolkien's notions are unrealistic and it's what his character strives towards. The Battle of Somme was the bloodiest battle of the First World War. Tolkien joined the Lancashire Fusiliers as a battalion signalling officer to the 11th Battalion and participated in the Battle of Thiepval Reach and capture of Regina Trench. For Tolkien, politics and violence is not interesting or fun to watch. It's horrible. The war took two of Tolkien's friends, Robert Gilson and Geoffrey Bat-Smith. Evil will always return and even victory will bring losses. But what was more important to Tolkien was not to lose oneself, to win the spiritual conflict within one's heart. What is more important is the willingness to fight for what's good and what's beautiful. Fantasy isn't real, and it isn't supposed to be realistic. It's a wishful world, an escapist world, and a world the way we would like to be. No school is like Hogwarts. There's no place as peaceful as the Shire, and perfect kings like Aragorn or heroes like Luffy who would stupidly risk their lives to do what's right do not exist. However, it's what we wish there was a school like Hogwarts. We wish there were kings like Aragorn or heroes like Luffy. And that isn't such a terrible thing. Everyone wants a friend like Sam, but we should try and be Sam.
I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you!
The world is a terrible and dark place, and it's quite wonderful that we humans can tell stories of hopeful worlds. Stories like that can inspire good. That isn't to say that mature and dark themes cannot be explored. In fact, stories like Lord of the Rings, One Piece and Harry Potter all have darkness. When seen closely, Lord of the Rings is a tragedy. Tolkien's tragedy is subtle and creeping.
I can see the shine.
He has himself said that it's a tale of death. Lord of the Rings is all about magic fading away from Middle-earth. Bilbo's tree is cut down, Frodo has PTSD and can't live in the Shire anymore, and within 13 months of the story, our characters visibly grew up many decades. The Dead Marshes are definitely a reflection of the Battle of Somme. Other than a few characters, the events are so tragic that most are broken inside. Martin has often said that the world doesn't need a good versus evil tale because in real life knights in shining armor do not defeat ugly monsters. And while that is true, that is how things should be. Instead of falling back into a darker structure, one should focus on moving towards a better world. That is the hero myth. The characters of the Lord of the Rings are complex and morally dubious, and the simple test for that is, would they have taken the ring? Aragorn, Gandalf and Galadriel didn't.
I'm giving it to you!
Don't tempt me, Frodo.
I passed the test.
But I'm sure everyone else would fall prey. Eowyn would use it to break her cage, Theoden to protect his kingdom, and while that doesn't necessarily make them evil, the evil characters had similar reasons to use the One Ring. It makes the characters more complex. Darkness and mature themes are often used as a means to make the story more intellectual, and that is an inappropriate way of telling a story, and it's rather cheap. Dark and mature themes should be used accordingly. A story with Batman would obviously be darker than a Superman story. Batman is a ground level hero who works in a dirtier city and doesn't have superpowers and thus has a harder time dealing with crime, and thus his stories are darker. However, that doesn't mean both stories can't be equally mature or deep. Neither that Superman must be made dark to be interesting. Tolkien perfectly understood that heroism and idealistic concepts are often used as a form of marketing tool. This is what Tolkien saw in Disney and made him possibly dislike Disney. Like a chameleon, he had told stories of heroism but with an intention of greed and to reach young, impressionable minds. On the surface, Tolkien and Disney are similar. They are both creative geniuses that have penned stories of fantasy epics. However, Tolkien was an artist and Disney was a brand, and that is what Tolkien disliked. He disliked the exploitation of idealism for greed, a theme Disney has followed into modern times as well with the likes of MCU. While idealistic stories are often used as a model for business by providing the audience with a cheap, happy and shallow tale and earn money off of them. The tide is slowly shifting towards mature and dark tales with the same incentive. Dark and mature tales and their consumption makes people feel like intellectuals, and speaking of misery is mistaken for practicality. In The Lord of the Rings, it's not the good always defeats evil, but that evil destroys itself. Morgoth spent all his powers in corrupting the natural world and thus was left weaker. The One Ring betrays Gollum for breaking a promise made in its name, and Gollum dies, but the ring also dies with him. And when Martin is truly at his best, he too touches upon this. Tywin's own machinations get him killed. His mistreatment of his son, his cold and pragmatic brutality and rationalizing of his actions are his doom. Similarly, Joffrey gets himself killed. Martin excels when he is exploring and expanding his world and character, and he suffers when he's single-mindedly picking off real-world politics and marking a story unnecessarily dark. Martin's work is like the ship of Theseus. Almost all the characters that start the story have died and new characters have replaced them, which makes you wonder if the story is even the same. It's important that darkness isn't glorified. What Tolkien has written is non-realistic. Tolkien isn't retelling real events. We have well-written history books for that. Tolkien is writing an epic fantasy series where people try their best to do what's good. Perhaps there's a Sauron inside all of us, our obsession to have control over everything, our deceit, our need for rationalizing every misdeed with the notion of greater good and so on. And perhaps it takes a Frodo to understand that only mercy, memories of the Shire, friendship and courage can defeat that. Perhaps it takes an Aragorn to stand unwavering when evil is apparent and alluring, a Sam to help those we love and forgive them when we understand why they are in pain. It's a battle deep inside us. A Theoden to acknowledge our mistakes, and Eowyn to find strength in healing. J.R.R. Tolkien left the Battle of Somme on the account of trench fever. He didn't return to the battle, but he won it in his heart.
No, the journey doesn't end here. Death is just another path. One that we all must take. The grey rain curtain of this world rolls back, and all turns to silver glass. And then you see it.
What? Gandalf. See what?
White shores.
Darkness isn't evil. It's what we do in the darkness that defines good or evil.